What's up with you guys from the Meat Lover channel? In this true account of infidelity, Sophie tells how she and her father-in-law ended up together after her mother-in-law passed away. It was a terrible thing, but her father-in-law really liked what she started doing. My name is Sophie, I'm 36 years old, and today I've decided to write to the channel to tell you all about the day I teased my widowed father-in-law nonstop. And as a result, he couldn't hold back. Stay until the end and don't miss any detail of this story. The drama really started after my mother-in-law died. Robert, my father-in-law, a man of 55, was widowed, and suddenly his life changed dramatically. Until then, he had always had someone around, a constant companion, but with the loss of his wife, he began to live days of absolute loneliness. With no one to share his routine with, he was left only with the silent company of his dog, a faithful companion who seemed to be the only one to bring some kind of comfort to his life. The house, which had once been full of life, was now plunged into an uncomfortable silence. His routine had become predictable, almost melancholy. Every day was the same. He woke up early as if he still had some obligation to fulfill, and walked around the neighborhood chatting with the neighbors. It was the typical behavior of many lonely elderly people, seeking, even briefly, some interaction to fill the void that the lack of company caused. These conversations with the neighbors, however trivial, were the only way Robert could feel part of the world around him. But after these brief encounters, he would return home and spend the rest of the day sitting in front of the TV, almost always looking away, fixed on the screen, but not really paying attention to what he was watching. It was as if he was physically there, but his mind was wandering somewhere far away, lost in memories, sad thoughts, and longing. Every year-end, as was customary, our family would get together to spend the Christmas and New Year celebrations together. We rented a beach house in the Lake District, where we spent a few days as a family. Robert, despite the loneliness that consumed him all year round, was visibly excited about this time of year. The change in his countenance was noticeable. When we arrived at the beach house, all he had to do was see the familiar faces for a smile to break out on his face, something that rarely happened during the rest of the year. He seemed like a different man, lighter, happier, as if, for a few days, he could forget the sadness that accompanied him. During these family gatherings, Robert never stopped talking. He would tell stories from the past, talk about anything from everyday events to old memories, as if he was desperate for attention, for some kind of human interaction. It was common for people who spend a lot of time alone to become more talkative when they finally have someone to talk to, and it was no different with him. We, as a family, understood the situation, but sometimes it was difficult to keep up with the pace of the conversations. The truth is that with the hustle and bustle of everyday life, work, responsibilities, and the worries that everyone had, we ended up not giving him the attention he perhaps needed, even when we were all together. Robert, who used to be a more discreet figure, seemed to have an urgent need to be heard, to connect with someone. During the holidays, he made a point of being at the center of attention, and we, between laughs and conversations, tried to include him as much as possible. Despite this, it was noticeable that as soon as the euphoria of the parties wore off, he returned to his natural, quieter, introspective state. Sometimes I would catch him looking out to sea with a faraway look in his eyes, as if he were trapped in his memories, living through a grief that seemed endless. The truth is that my mother-in-law's death not only took a part of him, but also changed the family dynamic. We all felt her absence in different ways, but Robert, who had lived with her for so many years, seemed to have lost the ability to move on. This worried us, but at the same time, no one knew exactly what to do to help him. There was a kind of collective helplessness. We knew he was suffering, but everyone's life took its course: work, commitments, responsibilities. This distanced us and, in a way, made us feel guilty for not being more present in his life. Noticing the difference in my father-in-law's mood when he was with his family, my husband began to think about the possibility of him moving in with us. As we already have a couple of children, the idea was to build another room in an area of the house that we didn't use, and thus accommodate my father-in-law in the best possible way. Stay until the end. You can't miss what's going to happen in this story. At first, I didn't like the idea very much. As I'm a housewife, having to pay attention to him all the time was irritating, as was the lack of privacy and all the hassle of working in the house. My husband couldn't think of any other alternative, even though I was against it. My only alternative was to try to get my father-in-law to deny the possibility of moving into our house. I waited for my husband to leave for work and went to my father-in-law's house to talk to him. When I got there, as soon as he heard about the possibility, he became very excited, started talking about how happy he was at that moment, and thanked me even before everything happened. But before he'd even finished talking, I told him I wasn't in favor of him moving in with us, causing him to go back to his sad face again. I confess that hurt me a little, but I still didn't want him living with us, and I told him not to accept it when my husband came to tell him about the idea. He kept quiet without saying anything. I went home, and it was still on my mind. Even though I was convinced of what I wanted, my conscience was heavy, and I started to think about what I could do to help. I started visiting him more often than usual, trying to get him to accept the idea of continuing to live alone and giving him a few reasons to motivate himself. What if you found someone else? Wouldn't you like more privacy? What if you brought your friends here to do some things? He just nodded, but the sad look remained. At times, I began to notice him getting lost in thought and staring at my headlights. "Wake up, Robert," I said, and he looked up and back at the planet. "You seem to like what you see." He continued to stare at me without understanding. "Think about what we talked about," I said as I got up and walked away towards the gate. I glanced over my shoulder, and he couldn't take his eyes off me. At home, I began to think about what I could do to go further and convince my father-in-law to continue living alone. The next day, as soon as my husband left for work, I sneaked over to my father-in-law's house again. As soon as he opened the door, he was sadder than before, thinking I was going to throw up again. "I've arrived, father-in-law. I've come to give your house a clean. You live alone, and yet the house looks awful." There was nothing wrong with the house, but I needed an excuse to be there. He sat down in the living room and started watching TV. I took a broom, went closer to him, and started to make myself more comfortable, with the excuse that it was hot and that the chemicals could stain my clothes. "You can't stay like this in this heat, can you, father-in-law?" I said. He couldn't take his eyes off me. Every time I cleaned near him, I bent down in that way, just to tease him. Every time I did this, he sighed differently. At one point, he started to realize what I was doing and grabbed my watermelon on purpose. I jumped up and asked him what he was doing. He was already giggling shyly with happiness. I didn't say another word and turned around to continue cleaning. As soon as I'd finished, I turned to him and said, "Keep living here. I'll keep cleaning the house for you," I said, while he drooled. "And keep quiet. Don't tell anyone I was here." I finished and went home, leaving my father-in-law more excited than ever. Then, the weekend arrived, and my husband and I went to his house to invite him to move in with us, as my husband had planned. Talk came and went, and my father-in-law was determined to move out of his house. He argued about the privacy he and we would lose, said he was feeling better after the end-of-year celebrations, and even that he was meeting someone new and didn't want to get in our way. After many attempts, my husband finally accepted his father's wishes. We returned home, relieved that everything had worked out, but without forgetting my promise. The following week, I was at my father-in-law's house for the weekly cleaning. Before, helping my father-in-law was a mere obligation, something I did without much thought. He was an older man, one of those who appear somewhat frail with age, and I was there to lend a hand as I always did. Over time, however, something began to change. What was once a routine task became a moment of hidden desire, something that excited me in a way I hadn't expected. The idea of teasing him in a subtle way amused me, almost like a game I was willing to play. Every time I went to his house to help with the chores, I began to feel more at ease. I didn't worry so much about formalities anymore. I let my headlights show, knowing full well what it did to the crown. Whenever he looked at me, his eyes would sparkle in a way that showed his repressed desire, and instead of feeling uncomfortable, I found it funny, as if I knew I was in control of the situation. Are you enjoying this story? Then leave it in the comments and let's interact. One day, while I was cleaning the living room, I once again felt his gaze on me. He pretended to be distracted by the television, but he couldn't help watching me. It was as if he was looking for an excuse to stare at me like that. I decided to play a little joke on him. "Did you miss something, Robert?" I asked with a smile on my face and the tone of someone who already knew the answer. He scowled, quickly looked away, and went back to staring at the television, but he couldn't disguise the slight redness on his face. It was obvious that he was being caught red-handed, but he pretended that nothing was happening, trying to keep a straight face. I, however, was enjoying it. I knew it was a silent provocation, but he couldn't resist, and neither could I. I turned back to continue cleaning, as if nothing had happened. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and I couldn't wait to see what the Crown's next move would be. It wasn't long before he lost control for good. Robert, unable to contain himself, came towards me and, without any warning, tried to grab my watermelon, as if that were the most natural gesture in the world. He always found a way to get close. With the quick reflex I had developed for these situations, I dodged him and laughed, walking towards the kitchen. I found the desperation in the way he moved funny, but at the same time, I couldn't deny that the whole thing made me a bit horny. As I walked away, I realized that he wasn't going to give up so easily. I heard his footsteps right behind me, firm and decisive, and before I could do anything, he was already catching up with me. Robert took me by surprise, kissing me nonstop, unexpectedly and intensely. For a moment, I couldn't react, but the desire that was in the air was between the two of us. His kiss, even coming from someone older, had an intensity that surprised me. It wasn't clumsy or awkward. It was firm, decisive, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. My body responded without hesitation. Even without saying anything, I ended up giving in and, with a gentle gesture, picked up his baseball bat. I knew that if I let him, he'd keep going as long as he could, but I was in control. "That's a present, your Robert," I said, smiling teasingly. "But today you've had enough." With that, I let go and moved away, leaving an air of mystery and desire in the room. He stood still for a moment, as if processing everything that had just happened. I, on the other hand, was ready to leave. I returned home with a different feeling from the one I usually felt on normal days. There was a mixture of desire, power, and a touch of guilt, as if I had played with fire, but had come out unscathed, at least for the time being, because the long-awaited moment was coming. The following weekend, by surprise, my father-in-law showed up at the house in the morning, unannounced. My husband greeted him and jokingly asked if he had changed his mind. He looked at us and said, "Who knows?" I have to confess that as much as I enjoyed joking with my father-in-law, I was annoyed by it. At one point, my husband left us to take a shower, and I was left alone with him in the kitchen. Needless to say, the Crown began to perk up. My husband got out of the shower, and the rest of the day went on as normal with his father-in-law returning to his house. The next day, as soon as I'd got rid of my husband, I was at the old man's house again. I arrived angry and asked him if he was mad, saying that he couldn't do that with my husband and children at home. He started laughing and said he was just teasing. He didn't even look like the frail, downcast man he was weeks ago. If you like this account of infidelity, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Everything was going exactly as I wanted. While I was doing my routine cleaning around the house, I couldn't help but notice that he, without any shame, began to relieve himself right there in front of me. The way he did it, the intensity with which his eyes followed me as I cleaned the bookcase, it all seemed part of a silent game, a game that suddenly began to awaken in me a pleasure I hadn't expected to feel. He increased the pace with every passing second, and even though I tried to concentrate on the housework, the truth was that it was hypnotizing me. My breathing changed, my hands trembled a little as they held the cloth I was using to clean. His every move was calculated, his every glance provoked me in a more intense way. "Stop it," I ordered, trying to maintain a firm tone of voice, still rubbing the shelf. I knew I needed to keep control of the situation, but my will was slowly slipping away. He just smiled, looking like he knew exactly what he was doing, that provocative smile, a mixture of mischief and confidence. I carried on and asked him one more thing. "Do you promise you won't do that again when you come to my house?" Still trying to keep some semblance of sanity in the face of what was happening. "It depends," he replied, his voice deep and husky without stopping to relieve himself. His eyes were locked on me, as if he were testing my limits, playing with my emotions, as if he knew I was one step away from losing control. At that moment, I felt a wave of heat take over my body, the pleasure growing in a way that was impossible to ignore. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but it was too late. Before I knew it, my hands were already close, and I started playing with that baseball bat, feeling his immediate reaction. His breathing became more and more panting, heavy, as if he was holding back. The atmosphere of tension and desire was unique. The pace got faster and faster, and I knew it couldn't last for long. Although he was holding firm, He was beginning to show signs that he was on the verge of his limit. His pressure seemed to rise, and in an instant I realized that what I was doing could indeed bring him to a dangerous point. But somehow, this only intensified the adrenaline coursing through my body. That's when, without saying another word, I kissed him. It wasn't just any kiss. It was with all the passion, all the repressed desire that I had been holding in until that moment. A deep, intense kiss, full of desire and surrender. The silence that had previously dominated the room was now broken by the sounds of our breathing. After that, there was no more room for hesitation. We gave ourselves to each other with an intensity I've rarely felt in my life. The minutes seemed to drag by and at the same time fly by. There was no world outside, just the two of us and the explosion of sensations that our bodies provided. We didn't stop for a second. That day, at that moment, it was as if time had stopped. All that mattered was the pleasure we were feeling and the certainty that we were giving ourselves completely, without reservations, without fear. As much as we had been fooling around for a while, this was our first real encounter. And honestly, it was a wonderful experience, the kind that marks you in an unforgettable way. The rejection that had existed before turned into pure adrenaline the moment we met alone, finally leaving behind the jokes and innuendos to experience something more spicy. Everything that had previously been just a distant fantasy became reality. After that day, something changed between us. It wasn't just the fact that we had finally given ourselves to each other, but also the way everything around us seemed to continue on its normal course, without anyone suspecting what was going on behind the scenes. My father-in-law, always discreet, showed a wit that frankly impressed me. When my husband, in his innocence, offered him a space in the house to stay, my father-in-law, with that smile of someone who knows more than he seems to, always politely refused. "I don't need that, my son. I'm happier than you can imagine," he would reply, keeping his gaze steady. And then he would add with false reassurance, "Congratulations on the woman you have. She'll take very good care of you. She's very attentive, coming here every day to look after me and clean the house." These words came out of his mouth as if they were a simple observation, but behind them there was a secret. What surprised me most was the way he managed to disguise everything so well, playing with words in such a calculated way without ever arousing suspicion. And, to be honest, part of me admired that. Seeing how he managed the situation, keeping up appearances without leaving any gaps, made me even more attracted to him. It was as if we were in a dangerous game where any wrong move could expose everything. But at the same time, that risk was what made it all the more exciting. I confess to you that this constant danger is what really stimulates me. The feeling of living a double life, of being a completely different person when I'm with him, makes me feel more alive than ever. It's as if, by breaking the rules, I'm challenging not only the world around me, but also myself, and that's addictive. At home, I'm the devoted wife, the woman who lovingly takes care of everything. But when I'm with him, it's as if I become someone else, a bolder, freer version of myself. Since I started getting involved with my father-in-law, at least I no longer have to look for adventures on the street or feel tempted to cheat on my husband with other men, like his friends. The double life I led with my father-in-law has become an escape valve, a secret that keeps me away from other dangers. I know it may sound contradictory, but in a way I feel it keeps me faithful on my own terms. After all, I'm not cheating on my husband with strangers, and that makes all the difference to me. What would you do if you were in my father-in-law's shoes? That's a question that makes me curious. It's not every day that someone finds themselves in a situation like this, and reactions can vary greatly. I wonder how each person would deal with the proposal I've made. Would you accept without a second thought? Or would you hesitate for some reason? Maybe you would even reject it for fear of the consequences or other people's opinions. And of course, don't forget to leave a like. See you tomorrow with the next story.